Okay, we're live. Hello, everybody. Hello, good evening in Brazil. Good morning in Australia. I don't know, good morning in South Australia, because we also invited some friends from that, some colleagues. I am Daniel Ferraz, and I am the coordinator of GEELLE, Grupo de Estudos sobre Educação Linguística em Línguas Estrangeiras. So, foreign language education research or study group. And today we're starting one more event. We'd like to thank you all for being here with us online. And let me just show you our event. And Michelle, help me out here. I'm going to do this maybe. And then I'm just going to show this. What am I going to show? This one. Yeah, this one. So today, GEELLE, seu grupo de estudos de educação linguística em línguas estrangeiras da Universidade de São Paulo, and CRESI, Joe and Kathleen will help me out with that, the Center for Research in Educational and Social Inclusion of the University of South Australia. We present a very special talk with Kathleen Heugh and Joe Windle, both from the University of South Australia. Let me just get my WhatsApp out, sorry. And then let me show you here back again. Sorry. Am I projecting, Michelle? Let me see. Let me project again, me. Yes, okay. So, and then Kathleen Heugh will talk about the emergence of Southern Multilingualisms as a perspective in research. And Dr. Joe Windle will be talking about developing Southern perspectives on language awareness, the concept of reciprocal multilingual awareness. So this is the international event of this semester, of this term, and we are very, very happy. I will very briefly read their CV, but not everything, just for you to have an idea, even though both of them are very, very famous in the areas that, especially in the area of education and multilingual education. So Kathleen Heugh, professor of language education and multilingualism, is a social applied linguist who specializes in language policy and planning, bilingual and multilingual education, and English medium of instruction. She uses multilingual pedagogies, including translanguaging and transknowledging, in her teaching of applied educational and sociolinguistics. Kathleen works with several large transnational organizations, including various agencies of the United Nations, the EU, the African Union, the transnational bodies such as the British Council, the international policy think tanks located in Africa, Central, South, and East Asia, Europe, and North America. Kathleen holds several honorary positions, including with the University of Western Cape and the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa and the National Multilingual Education Resource Center, amongst many other honorary positions. She has been a distinguished visiting professor at Rhodes University, University of South Africa, visiting professor at universities of Ghent and Geneva, visiting scholar at the University of Antwerp and Leuven, the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. She has worked with Christopher Stroud and many other colleagues that are well known for us Brazilians. And so thank you, Kathleen. It's really an honor for us, the Brazilian audience scholars. We also have future teachers, future educators watching us here right now. And as this is recorded, they can see it later on. Thank you, Kathleen, for being here with us. It's the microphone, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Danielle, for welcoming me, but also for your wonderful invitation for myself and also for Joel Windle to be here today. I'd just like to start by saying that anything I know, anything that I do comes from learning from my colleagues over many years, mostly in Africa, but also in all of the places where I have been fortunate enough to do field research, particularly in remote areas of sub-Saharan Africa, but also, as you say, in Central Asia and India. So if maybe we could go to my slides.
Yes, yes, of course.
Right. So what has happened over the last 10, 15 years is that colleagues and I have been really quite amazed that scholars in the Northern Hemisphere have been discussing multilingualism as if this is a new phenomenon. People in the Global South have known about multilingualism for a very long time. Scholars have been working with multilingualism. Communities know how to negotiate their way through different languages. They know how they use different languages for different purposes. And there's been an enormous amount of dialogue between many of us in post-colonial countries of the Global South, from Brazil, various countries in South America, various countries in Africa, and also particularly in South Asia, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on. So once these conversations started round about the early 2000s in Europe and North America, it seemed that the North American and European scholars completely forgot that people in the South knew quite a lot about multilingualisms, and our voices were excluded from a lot of the discussions. So Christopher Stroud, together with me and colleagues of ours, decided to consider proposing the term Southern Multilingualisms. But it's not just about multilingualism and language, it's also about the epistemological systems that different peoples of the South work with and are very important in their worldviews. So eventually this has turned into something that we at this university are proposing as Southern Multilingualisms, knowledges, and an approach towards decolonizing education. And we are trying to develop a research program in this area. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the slide number 3, please. Yes, so Southern Multilingualisms, knowledges and decolonization, or decolonizing education, is designed to investigate and respond to growing domestic and international concerns about the nature, causes, and implications of inequalities that we see carrying on, continuing through the colonial period to the present for Indigenous, migrant, and displaced communities. And our concerns intersect with recognizing various forms of diversities. These are linguistic, epistemological, and conflict, displacement, and consequences of the shifts in economic and military power that is taking place from the Euro-North towards the post-colonial South and also East at the moment. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So what we are proposing is that a research program that is looking at multilingualisms from a Southern perspective, looking at the pluriversality of different knowledge systems, is a way to decolonize education, and that we recognize that the calls for decolonizing education, specifically education, have been amplified since 2015, when students at the University of Cape Town and all over South Africa started to rebel against what they called the coloniality of education. And they captured this call through something called the Rhodes Must Fall movement, because Rhodes was one of the most formidable of the colonial figures in the African history, or rather the British colonization of Africa. And he symbolized everything, or symbolizes everything that people feel have been oppressive in Africa for many communities. Now, these calls for decolonizing education were amplified during COVID-19, and they've drawn attention to how can equality and social cohesion in education be achieved for Indigenous, minoritized, and displaced communities to secure safe local, national, and regional futures. And the question interconnects with transnational frameworks that relate to inclusion, socioeconomic transformation, safety, and security. And of course, the immediate stakeholders are Indigenous communities, migrant communities, people who are displaced, refugee peoples, and also the communities into which they migrate. It also obviously has impact on diasporas of people who have migrated all over the world. The secondary stakeholders are these public agencies, government departments, and the transnational bodies like UNESCO, the various bodies of the UN, and so on. They also include the World Bank, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This organization was supposed to try to keep a balance of power, particularly in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. But as you can see and realize, they failed because of the current situation in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. And then also another one of these bodies is a body which is called ASEAN, that is the Southeast Asian, it's Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So the project of Southern Multilingualisms, Knowledges and Decolonizing Education articulates also in a domestic level in South Australia with our own education department, government department's Aboriginal Education Strategy, which began in 2019. It's meant to be a 10-year strategy. This sort of dovetails with UNESCO's key and intersectoral programs that prioritize multilingualism and Indigenous knowledges in order to promote and ensure inclusion in education. And so these two of these are the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which of course many people know about, which run from 2022 to 2032. And also another key program, the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems, the LINKS program that's been running since 2020, particularly for desert and small island communities. It also responds to a commitment that the UN member countries agreed to in late 2018, which is something called the Global Compact on Refugees. In other words, all member countries of the UN are supposed to collaborate with supporting those countries that receive large numbers of refugees. More than 50% of the displaced and refugee populations go to very poor or low income countries, and those countries don't have the facilities or resources to look after and take adequate care of refugees. And the UN's compact was designed or intended to ensure that rich countries would actually contribute their share of providing resources, adequate resources for refugees. So the next slide, please. So we're getting closer to what it is that our research program is really focused on. And I'm looking here at the theory and aim behind it. So we are drawing from decolonial and Southern theory. And by that, I mean, we are drawing from the large body of decolonial and Southern theories that have been circulating between very well-known scholars in South America, the South Asian context, as well as Africa. So we start really with the work of Paulo Freire and Rodolfo Kusch from Argentina, also Chilean scholars Maturana and Varela, Australian scholars Raywin Connell and Martin Nakata, and then back to people who've been working with contexts of South and Central America, Escobar, Mignolo, Walsh, and Santos. It builds on Southern Multilingualisms and Diversities Consortium, a catalyst project that was begun at this university in 2014. It builds on the concept of transknowledging, because people who work with multilingualism realize that multilingualism is not just about language, it's also about knowledge. It's about the exchange of, and a reciprocal exchange of knowledge. And transknowledging is really a companion concept with translanguaging. It includes a concept of kulini, which is an indigenous word, a Pitjantjara word that Sam Osborne and colleagues who've been working in the Anangu, Pitjantjara, Yankunytjatjara lands in the central Australian desert areas. And it's something that people refer to as the indigenous knowledges, the knowledge of the land, the knowledge of the stars, the skies, their histories, and the ecology, really. It includes the notion of literacy as being something that is not a Western concept, but there are different kinds of literacies. So the indigenous communities in the middle of Australia, particularly Anangu, have very different ways of conceptualizing literacy. And Janet Armitage is somebody who's been working in the central areas of Australia for many years, has been studying the ways in which literacy, what literacy actually means for Indigenous peoples. And it's not just reading and writing, it's connected to song, dance, art, the places where literacy takes place, which is not inside classrooms and schools, but perhaps outside in dry riverbeds and so on. It also draws on the work of May French, one of our colleagues who's been working on purposeful translanguaging. It draws on concepts of racism, heritage, and refugee students in education in the work of other colleagues, Melanie Bark, Joel Windle, and culturally responsive pedagogies in the work of some of our colleagues, Morrison, Irabina Rigney, Rob Hatton, and Abigail Diplock. So the aim of this project is to conduct research with multilingual communities in Southern contexts that were formerly under European colonial influence. So if you can go to the next slide, I think I may just about be out of time. So we actually have five nodes, if you like, for our project. The first one is that we're focusing on Aboriginal or Indigenous communities. And there we are looking at the concepts of voice, agency, conversations between peoples of the South. So conversations we hope very much will continue between colleagues in Brazil and ourselves, and also looking at decolonizing policy frameworks. The second node also relates to Aboriginal or First Nations, and the focus is on knowledges, language systems, and education. And here we are looking at the concepts of kulini, transknowledging, and translanguaging. The third node has to do with languages and knowledges in education, with displaced, refugee, and or minority students in the Asia Pacific. We're doing this because we are located in the Asia Pacific. Australia is the biggest island in the Asia Pacific. And then the fourth node is looking at multilingualisms and knowledges and education in small island communities in the Asia Pacific. So we're hoping to shift our attention to the small islands, particularly in response to some of the concerns that are articulated by UNESCO at the moment, but also because we are very much aware of some of the dangers of climate change for small island communities. And the last, and the but not the least, of our nodes of attention is multilingualisms, knowledges, and decolonizing higher education. So because we're based in a university, we're obviously interested in how these matters actually articulate with what's happening in terms of our curriculum and the ways we go about working with students in higher education. So I think that I'm getting pretty close to the end. I think that maybe you could skip the next slide and just, yes, if you could go to that slide. So what we're looking at here is decolonizing discourses of literacy and multilingualism in education. We're interested in research about literacy and multilingualism, shifting from north-north to north-south discussions and debates. We are looking at colonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial, and recolonizing the master narratives that are embodied in the literature of literacy and education. And so we're trying to counter the myth that there is a single epistemology, a single way of understanding knowledge, a single way of treating knowledge in university systems. Now, this is in parallel with more than 5 decades of Southern decolonial South-South collaborations, but we have to recognize that not everybody working in decolonial studies is traveling along exactly the same trajectory. We come from very different epistemological backgrounds, different histories, different ecologies of multilingualism, different ecologies of knowledge systems that exist side by side. So it is obviously natural that there will be several different trajectories traveling in a similar direction, but not necessarily always intersecting. So we are interested in the plurality of these trajectories, and we're interested in Southern research. We are very concerned about multiple languages and knowledges, and how we might be able to translate and engage in reciprocal exchanges of knowledge, with something that we are calling transknowledging. And essentially the aim is to try to restore the balances and among the plurality of belief systems, cosmologies, the way we understand our being in the world, our ontologies, and epistemologies, systems and ways of knowing. In other words, what we're really trying to do is to see if is there a way to restore a humanity of care, hope, and love, a concept that very much aligns with and is informed by Maturana and his colleagues. And I think that's really it. We've got some, we've been working on this for a while. We have some resources in a number of publications.
Wow. Thank you, Kathleen. And as we bring Joel, and I think we had this conversation in Australia, right? When I was there, like, of course, the historical context, they are different, etc. But we do share many struggles, right? Like in Brazil, we face this monolingualism. Even when we talk about Brazilian Portuguese, people take for granted that we are a monolingual country. But then what happens to the other 270 still live indigenous languages, right? And
Wow.
yeah, the past 4 years they have been very difficult in terms of language policies and etc. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's really important that we have these conversations because although they're different histories, there are stories that chime with one another. And I think that what we learn from one context very often helps us to see how we might be able to be thinking about these issues in another context. And we have and what I can say is, because some of my work is obviously comes from Africa, that we learn so much from the scholarship from South America in our work in South Africa. So it's been really, really very influential.
Mhm.
And we continue to learn from South
Yeah.
American scholars.
Yeah, your final words when you mentioned the humanity of care, love, and hope. This is, first of all, very beautiful. And sometimes many of language educators, we forget this, right? And this is Paulo Freire to me, you know. Freire, he mentioned a lot these terms, the care, love, and hope. There's a book, The Pedagogy of Hope. There is, and we see that well, sometimes they're words that we should never talk about because of this very scientific, positivistic, neoliberal, you know, context that has invaded, you know, language education in Brazil. Well, thanks for that. I'm going to call Joel, and then thanks, Kathleen. We'll bring you back in a second. And Joel, hello. Oops. Where's
Hi,
Joel?
Danielle. How are you?
Hi, Joe. Let me just say a few words about you. And first of all, thank you, Joe, for being with us um, at GEELLE. So, Dr. Joe Windle's research and teaching focuses on cultural and linguistic diversity, and in particular, how community-based literacies can make curricula more inclusive. Joel is currently leading an international study on innovative teaching practices involving partners from Brazilian and North American universities, as well as community-based organizations and school educational authorities. His research has received support from the Australian Research Council, Brazilian National Council of Scientific and Technological Development, and the State Research Foundation of Rio de Janeiro. As many publications, but it includes Making Sense of School Choice, an awarded book, a Cornell Prize, and amongst so many other publications that we can share with you. Joe, thank you very much for being with us. This lovely Sextou conversation, Friday night in Brazil, Saturday morning. And thank you very much, Joe, for being here with us. It's really an honor. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry. Sorry. Yes. I was going to mute myself. I muted you. Say that again. Sorry.
Boa noite. Sextou no Brasil, sábado já na Austrália. It's a real honor to be here with Danielle and with a South-South meeting today between Australia and Brazil. And I would like to just bring up some lyrics that I mentioned in a previous talk from Ziggy Ramos, who's an Australian Indigenous rapper who's done a version of From Little Things, Big Things Grow. And he says, we start our story in 1493 with a piece of paper called The Doctrine of Discovery. And that's a good reminder of the starting point of coloniality. Brazil has a different history of coloniality to Australia, but they both share points in common, including this starting point of European doctrines emanating and imposing themselves. So I think I would like to acknowledge that I'm here in Australia on the land of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to them and to all Indigenous people in Australia and around the world, including in Brazil, as I start my presentation. Like Kathleen, I've got some slides. I'm going to talk a little bit about how coloniality and decolonial thinking can come into a concept called language awareness, and explain a little bit about why we're thinking of a concept we're calling reciprocal multilingual awareness. So I'm presenting work here that I've been developing together with Kathleen and some other colleagues, May French, Janet Armitage, and Li Ching Chang. So I'd like to say hello to them and acknowledge their contributions to what I'm going to be presenting here. And so this idea of reciprocal reciprocity, two-way conversation, listening, I think from Kathleen's talk, it's very evident how that's so important. And if we move along, the original concept of language awareness that we're building on is quite a simple one. It's a division between being able to speak a language and knowledge about a language. So you can see that in that original definition, if we move along the slides, there's no concept of even a speaker. It's knowledge about language. So there's an association for language awareness. That is the conversation that we're speaking into. It's a European organization, has a journal, and their definition of language awareness is explicit knowledge about language and conscious perception and sensitivity in language learning and language teaching. So that can be distinguished from some other types of knowledge that teachers have. And as you can see, this is a fairly abstract idea of knowledge and language and knowledge of students, and maybe an understanding of different concepts of language other than the concept which might come from the university classroom is missing. So this is a concept which has been challenged as also being quite monolingual, even though it's been used in second and foreign language classrooms. It kind of doesn't have any sense of interaction between languages or what reactions people might have to other languages they're not familiar with, when that's not part of the specific classroom objectives. So what happens when multiple languages or registers are used outside of a language classroom, for example, in the playground or in the community or in the staff room? So that idea of translanguaging, for example, is quite outside of this concept. If we move along, there's been some moves centered again in the global north to develop the idea of language awareness towards multilingual language awareness, and to also bring a critical angle towards that. And if we move the slides along, there's a specific type of knowledge about language that's embedded in that. So the most well-known definition of this move is from Ophelia Garcia, and she's writing about, I guess, the context of bilingual education in the US and specifically in New York, and also in a context where bilingual education has come under threat, and where bilingual speakers are devalued and disqualified and racialized often. So she tries to broaden out language awareness to focus on not just knowledge of language, but knowledge of speakers, and also to bring in an idea of citizenship and of awareness of colonial pasts. What's interesting as well here is that, like other parts of her body of work, Garcia is very concerned that a key strategy is to emphasize that language is socially constructed. So thinking about languages as invented and so on. And in our own thinking, we have been kind of considering how this specific view of language can be productive in some settings, but in other settings it could be counterproductive, or might ignore definitions of language and languaging which come from the community, which come from students themselves, and that there is a danger when we bring in any set of concepts, including the ones that we're presenting today, that we impose them without listening to our students, without listening to their communities, and that reproduces, maybe not monolingualism, but reproduces the logic of a monologic epistemology. So if we move along, we've been thinking about, as the goal of multilingual awareness, multilingual citizenship. So as Kathleen mentioned, multilingual citizenship or linguistic citizenship is a concept which comes out of language research in the Global South, sociolinguistics in the Global South, and it's something which really emphasizes agency and definition of language and languaging in local contexts and communities. And so here we're trying to think about reciprocal multilingual awareness as part of multilingual citizenship, as having as its ultimate goal not just fluent speakers, not just very aware teachers, sensitive teachers, but also of having multilingual citizenship as the ultimate goal of any kind of language awareness. And that for that to happen, there has to be reciprocal listening and searching for dialogue between teachers, communities, students, and institutions. And so we do have some examples of where there is an attempt or a failure to have that kind of dialogue across those different groups here that we've got in this graphic. So if we move along. So we have tried to then theorize this reciprocal multilingual awareness into a number of dimensions. So the first one is the directionality of awareness. So rather than the theory producing awareness in the teacher who then generates awareness in students, or even just the teacher developing their awareness of their own students, which is more along the lines of the Garcia model, we're keen here to really expand and complicate the directions in which awareness can flow. So from the community to the teacher was probably a key one that we're concerned with. Amongst students, particularly when we have monolingual students and multilingual students, and those multilingual students are devalued or laughed at, and teachers may be bystanders in those kind of situations. But also the reverse, if we have people who are multilingual in prestige varieties of languages, named languages, who are maybe humiliating or making fun of students who are not multilingual speakers of prestige varieties or are monolingual and language learners. The second dimension is multilingual sensibility. So this is, I guess, the appreciation of how different language regimes come into contact and interact in ways that influence our own language choices. So if we come into the classroom as a teacher and we want all of our students to start translanguaging, we might find that there's some resistance, and some of that resistance might have good reasons behind it. The same way that when we come into a classroom and expect students to only speak the foreign language being taught, or to only use English, for example, then we're trampling over multilingual sensitivities that might be sharper than our own as teachers. The third dimension there is transformative pedagogical action. So that is the ways in which we recontextualize or rethink these language regimes as part of our practice as teachers. So that's where we look at what identities are indexed by the language uses we present, what relationships are embedded in those. I think the classic one in English teaching, for example, is that we have North American speaking subjects at the center, white speaking subjects, and we exclude other identities. And we don't even need to do that ourselves, because there are other discourses and media that do that for us as well. And the final dimension there is the locus of agency. So shifting the locus of multilingual awareness, not just from the language to the speaker, but shifting that locus of agency to the student who's in front of us, and to the work that they do to transform those indexicalities and ideologies, and to take a global theory or a northern theory and subvert it or transform it in some way. So thinking about how those things occur. So if we move along to the next slide. So the work that we've been doing has been across a few different settings. So in thinking about directionality, some of that has been in Australian Indigenous communities in the state of South Australia, where I'm speaking from, and thinking about how local communities think about their own languages in relation to English, and also how schooling fits into that, and what they can do when the ways that languages are being used in schools and taught in schools or excluded from schools it doesn't fit what they would like. In terms of multilingual sensibility, we've got some research here led by May, which is in a suburban secondary school where the students are multilingual. They're interested in using various languages with their peers and even in preparing schoolwork, but they are not always as keen to have that use in their written work, especially when it comes to assessment tasks, which are high stakes. So we have there what might be considered to be a lack of awareness by students when they're being encouraged to use their multilingual repertoire in assessment tasks. If we come in and we're as promoting full translanguaging multilingualism, but their own sensibility or evaluation of which language they would like to use also needs to be respected and thought about in terms of why they're thinking in those ways. In terms of transformative pedagogical action, here at the University of South Australia, we've been attempting to engage with the ways that our multilingual students are using translation tools, for example, and how they have multilingual study strategies and strategies for preparing their work, which are strategies that, of course, we ourselves might also use, but which the institution is struggling to recognise. And the institution sees multilingual speakers as English language learners. And the transformative shift here is to try and get the university and ourselves as university teachers to think about multilingual students as being able to teach us and to teach their monolingual peers, and teach us as well about these strategies for using translation tools to gain access to different types of knowledge. And finally, and here turning to the Brazilian setting, re-signifying globally circulating knowledge about language. So I think the most interesting one here for me is the idea of English as a lingua franca. English as a lingua franca is an idea which is not exactly revolutionary. Lingua franca is the idea of a common or shared language that's used for instrumental transactions. So it's a long way from thinking about coloniality. It's a long way from thinking about identity and empowerment. But the way that a lot of Brazilian English teachers and teachers of other languages like French, actually, other lingua francas, talk about this concept really does subvert it and extend it in very interesting ways that I think demonstrates how the locus of agency can shift even when we take a global theory and bring it locally. So that is kind of a reciprocal relationship as well. Instead of taking the global theory and absorbing it and reproducing it in our classroom, that it's taking a global theory and giving it a radical or even decolonial edge. So I might skip through the slides and just show the final slide here, folks, if I can. So I do have some quotes from the other settings, but here are some from Brazil. So this is from a student, Luan. With the many different accents present across a large extent of our country, it is no surprise that a Brazilian English accent and its variations exist, and speakers should not be forced to follow almost imperialist standards on how their pronunciation of a foreign language is supposed to be. So you can see there elements of this kind of decolonial sensibility. And a second student here, nowadays, as an English-speaking language consumer, I'm learning to unlearn in order to acquire other ways to speak the English language, such as Jamaican, South African English, and the like, which in turn are some among other variations that are invisible due to this industry that regulates to the detriment of other possibilities of expressing oneself. And here the industry refers to commercial language courses. And what's also interesting is that this Brazilian, made in Brazil version of English as a lingua franca, to borrow a term from Danielle Ferraz and Ana Paula Duboc, this made in Brazil version is also connected to perspectives on Portuguese, and Portuguese as a language with variation, and which is also a language shaped by ideologies and prejudice towards particular registers and towards particular speakers. And I guess that's due in part to some of the influence of a longer work in Brazilian Portuguese, like the work of Marcus Wagner. So I hope that in this presentation, I've been able to show a little bit of some of the details of our work, and I would be very keen to continue the reciprocity with some conversation with Danielle and everybody who's listening.
Yeah, we do have some questions already and comments. Thanks, Joe. Joe, go back, Michelle. Just this data is from they're Brazilians, right? And it is
so these are students of Letras Inglês at
Rio de Janeiro.
In Rio de Janeiro,
Okay.
and they are studying phonetics and phonology,
which is the course that the undergrad course that I'm responsible for now.
Yes. So you might have heard similar things.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Joe. We're going to take advantage that we still have some time. We're going to bring back Kathleen. Can we bring back Michelle? And I just forgot to say thank you to Michelle Avelar and to Lucas, who's here, Lucas Rigonato. He's also a GEELLE member, and Lucas is going to help me with the questions from YouTube, from the audience. Okay. Before that, Lucas, can I ask one or two questions? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So, I was talking to Kathleen, right? Just when she finished her talk, we do have this monolingual, orientation to language policy, etc. But we do have the presence of this is at least 270 indigenous languages and lots of other named languages that here we consider foreign languages, right? Now, my first question for both of you would be, those who are problematizing or criticizing or critiquing monolingualism, this monolingual orientation, they kind of divide themselves like into multilingual perspectives and plurilingual, so plurilingualism. So I'd like to know your ideas on this. If this naming, this political naming, because this is very strong in Brazil. I don't know if it is the case for you in your context, but there are those people, oh, this is not multilingualism, this is actually plurilingualism. And we do have a lot of discussions on translanguaging, like translingual practices. So I'd like to know a little bit of your ideas on this. And connecting to this, a second question would be going back to plurilingual, multilingual, or translingual perspectives on all of these languages and linguistic repertoires. In Brazil, since 2018, Joe, as you know, we have the national curriculum that was approved, okay, Kathleen? And in this is the official document. Regarding the linguistic policy, the language policy, let's say, the English language was established as the only and prior foreign language in Brazil. This is in the document. So they stated that English should be the only. What they do? Oh, maybe, well, Spanish can be used as a foreign language if the context, but English is the global language. English is the language of the it should be our foreign language. So this is stated. This was very polemic. I mean, what happens with schools with basic education is that they have to kind of apply this document because it is official. So I'd like to hear from you. I mean, these two questions that for me are very, very interrelated, you know, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Maybe I could just say that in Australia, my understanding is that people refer to multilingualism and plurilingualism taking their definition from the one that is used by the Council of Europe, that individuals who have many languages are plurilingual, but you have a society in which you have many plurilingual people, but the society is regarded as multilingual. From my understanding of the discussions in the African context, countries that had been colonized by France and Portugal referred to plurilingualism. Countries that had been colonized by Britain referred to multilingualism. So my understanding has always been that this is just simply a translation of the term, and that the two, plurilingualism and multilingualism in the African context, in the way that ordinary people refer to these concepts, is interchangeable. However, the terms are becoming politicized. And I think the terms have become politicized in some of the critical applied linguistics discourses, where there's been an attempt by some scholars to differentiate plurilingualism from multilingualism. And there has been almost a way of stigmatizing the term multilingualism as meaning multiple separate languages. Now, this is an understanding that people have had from the Canadian setting, where bilingual education was linked to the immersion programs, where you immerse kids in one language and then you separate the one language from the other language. So you treat the two languages separately. But in the African context, it's never been possible to separate languages. Even if the policies have tried to do this, in practice, it's never possible. People move back and forth between all of their languages. In every single classroom you go into, you will find that teachers and students are flip-flopping between back and forth and using their linguistic repertoires. But they also know when it comes to examinations and assessment items, the kids will have to separate their languages at that point. But it's not possible to separate pedagogies in the classroom. So that's what I can say.
Joe?
Yeah, just picking up on translanguaging, that's a very popular concept globally, I guess, for our field. And I think that it does have, it is important to recognize and to value language uses that do mix together different named languages and different registers, and not to stigmatize that, and not to try and have schools as monolingual spaces. And I think that's a problem. And I think translanguaging is a useful concept. As Kathleen mentioned, it's not such a new concept. It's a concept that's visible in Indian and African scholarship before its current popularity. And so I think as decolonial scholars, what we have to do is to recognize that a lot of the translanguaging work that has gained the most visibility is also local knowledge of the global north. It's local knowledge of problems of schools in New York or Florida or California. And that the problems that we have in schools or other spaces in Brazil and Australia, or in an Indigenous community in Australia compared to a suburban school in Australia, might be different. And that the strategy of denaturalizing named languages and pointing to, the fluidity between languages may not have the same transformative power. And in fact, it can have some dangers. So if we think about translanguaging, often it's in spoken language, but it doesn't extend to written assessment tasks or to textbooks. And if we think about translanguaging in Brazil between English and Portuguese, that's often an elite practice and can be used for social closure rather than for breaking down barriers. If we think about people on Faria Lima who are using, throwing English in every other word, every other sentence, they're doing that to mark themselves off. So there is a lot of elite translanguaging, which is part of practices of social closure, which is different from what might be a kind of a more democratic idea of translanguaging. So I think that it's important for us to think in our setting what translanguaging might look like, what the benefits might be, and what else might be needed for transformation other than the strategies suggested in the translanguaging pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Could you guys also comment on the English, let's say, I would say almost imposition as the only foreign language in our official documents? Would you like to?
Kathleen, would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, look, I'm pretty shocked by that. But I also see this as part of the way in which English has been advanced very rapidly as for various reasons, I think, political, economic reasons globally, particularly over the last 20, 30 years. And I think that it definitely started with the information technology innovations in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, but it's taken on a life of its own, and particularly this seems to have escalated over the last 10, 15 years. All of the discussions around Brexit have meant for the influence of the United Kingdom that it's really important to advance the status of English, the English language. So Cambridge University Press and Assessment and the English language industry, supported by the British Council, have really escalated their efforts across beyond Europe into Southeast Asia. I think that they have, I'm not sure the degree to which they were already very active in South America. I suspect quite a lot. But they've done all sorts of really interesting things. For instance, in Africa, they have been moving into countries that were had not been colonized by Britain, and have gradually managed to displace, for instance, the role of French in many parts of West Africa. They've moved into Ethiopia, which had never been colonized by any country. And although the Ethiopian government had implemented a multilingual policy, British advisors have come in, English language advisors have come in from Cambridge, and they have pretty much undone the multilingual policies in Ethiopia. They moved into Rwanda, which had been Belgian colonial influence, the influence of the French language as an official language. They've displaced French as the official language in Rwanda, suggesting that English is the language of national unity. It's a neutral language. They tried very much to suggest that English could resolve the situation in Afghanistan, and they invested quite a lot in a report on the potential for English language to resolve all of the conflict in Afghanistan. And of course, that was ridiculous, completely ridiculous. So I'm sure that you've got many things to say about the role of English in South America. My concern is that it is foreclosing all the knowledge that is available. It's layering over and excluding again the knowledges that were already there, that were ecologizing through the different hierarchical and democratic ecologies of language everywhere.
Joe?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the cargo cult of English as symbolizing or embodying all kinds of capitalist fantasies and to the detriment of other languages. And so I think that's another way plurilingualism has been used more recently in Brazil, is in defense of having multiple second languages or additional languages taught in school. So specifically Spanish, which has lost space, but also other languages, Italian, German, French, that have been taught in Brazilian schools and which have been marginalized by kind of monolingual English juggernauts, really. And I think as important is the way the language is taught. And actually, specifically for English, that's even more important. But even, for French and German, if we think about, Rio, where there are bilingual German schools, how are you teaching German? What identities, what kinds of agency, what kinds of reciprocity are connected to German as it's taught in a school in the west of Rio? And the same with English. I think more as important as the choice of the English language is what are the ideologies, what are that we're bringing with that, and which maybe it's better not to have English if we're teaching it in a way that the main learning from it is a sense of your own inferiority, a sense of US superiority, and maybe a few words here and there on the side. So I think that's very important.
So I'm going to leave you with Lucas. He still has some questions from the audience, very interesting questions, and then I'll be here helping Michelle on the backstage. Lucas, thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you Danielle, and thank you Professor Kathleen, thank you Professor Joe for your generosity in sharing your ideas with us. I have here a few comments and a few questions. Let's see if we have time for them. We have one from Sandro. He says that he particularly likes this GEELLE meeting, considering that what we have done to indigenous communities in Brazil. That comment is also corroborated by Cecilia. She thanks Professor Kathleen and comments on the term Southern Multilingualisms, which is linked to the decolonization. And again, given that we have a few similarities between Brazil and Australia and the way we have treated the native peoples. Then I have a question from Cecilia that could be to both of you, so I'll give you the time. She says that it's crucial to remember how multilingualism remains so tied to prestige languages. And then she asks, which multi is acceptable? She'd like to know how you see multilingualism conflicted with nationalism these days. I think this is a question to both of you. So maybe first, Professor Kathleen.
That's a really interesting question, because from where I come from, from an African context, I never thought of multilingualism as something that is tied to a kind of hierarchical, privileged multilingualism. I always thought of multilingualism as the languages that communities speak. the languages that I heard people using whenever I went into remote and rural contexts. So for me, multilingualism is actually the languages that people actually speak in their communities, the way they speak in their communities. And all of my work has been around trying to understand what are we missing if we speak a language like English or Spanish or Portuguese or French. What is it that we are not hearing? So I'm less interested in the so-called international or privileged languages. I'm concerned about what we are losing by not understanding the way that people have knowledges. They have scholarship. It may be different kinds of scholarship, but we are losing so much knowledge of the world, so much knowledge of the environment by not understanding the multilingualisms of ordinary people in communities. And so that's where my focus has been. I'm not interested, my work is not interested in multilingualism in terms of the powerful languages. So in terms of nationalism, the idea that a single language can unify a country and bring it together, particularly those countries that were conquered by European powers from the 17th century onwards, is ridiculous. It's failed in every single one of those countries. It's never unified people. It's destroyed communities. It's destroyed systems. It's just a very destructive process. So I just think we need to shift away from the idea of thinking that one language is a solution for a national identity. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Kathleen. Professor Joel?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the conversation is still focused on prestige languages, but also on contexts which are not very multilingual. So a recent study has shown that the vast majority of research on multilingualism is from Europe and North America, and the vast number of multilingual speakers and languages are located in India, Papua New Guinea, Africa, and Latin America, Asia. So there's a huge problem in our field where there's a mismatch between who is producing knowledge about multilingualism that circulates globally and where multilingual speakers are and their practices. And that's connected to that's coloniality, isn't it? So that's connected to, I think, the way that we teach language as well. So in addition, I think I'm repeating myself a little bit, beyond the language that we're teaching or the languages that we're teaching or that we have as official languages, it's the way that we use language. So I think, Philipson's linguistic imperialism has a lot of good things to say. And I think the critique of that it's not the language that's imperialistic, it's the people who use it and what they use it for who are imperialistic. I think that's important to remember. And it is possible to think about even the prestige languages as being used for anti-imperialist purposes, but it can't be done without recognition of indigenous languages in Brazil, for example, Afro-diasporic language use and the influence on our prestige languages of other languages. So in Australia, we have varieties which are known as Creole or Aboriginal English. We have indigenous languages that also have a lot of English presence, so that are already quite different from the way that the indigenous languages were used prior to colonization. And similarly in Brazil, if we think about a concept like português, that's a way of rethinking what Portuguese is, to think about Portuguese as having some variation which reflects and represents the interests of Black speakers and the heritage of African languages. So hidden in prestige languages are indigenous languages, are African languages. And so if we think about those dimensions, and if we think about speakers as well as languages, that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Professor Joel. The discussion makes me think of Mignolo's saying epistemology creates ontology. And by allowing languages, local languages, to exist, we are allowing their knowledge to exist, and therefore new existences, right? Not new, but existence that are possible. Which also makes me think, Professor Joel, on the discussion about developing language awareness with learners, with students, because what is language if not knowledge, right? A repertoire of words and an instrument to us for us to exist. It makes me think of the artificial intelligences, how language is being used by, manipulated by artificial intelligences, and it causes obviously commotion in education, which makes me think of a few years back when the cell phones were inserted in the classroom, and many of us teachers resisted, others embraced it. How do you see the connection between language awareness and using artificial intelligences such as ChatGPT? And that's my question, if I may.
Okay, good question. So one of our colleagues, May French, has been trying to get ChatGPT to do translanguaging fairly unsuccessfully. So artificial intelligence may be monolingual, at least to date, and probably likely to reproduce those prestige varieties. And because it's based on corpus of whatever's out there already, to reproduce that knowledge which is already most widely spread. And so in a research methods class, one of our students used ChatGPT to do some analysis of interviews and to suggest techniques of analysis. The techniques that ChatGPT suggested are the most traditional, the most well-known, the ones from John Creswell. So in a way, I think even though there are benefits in ChatGPT specifically in summarizing large amounts of information, I think there is, in terms of language, the danger that it will just reproduce a single, version of language, and that it will find that knowledge which is already the most dominant and unquestioned, and we will also maybe be even less likely to question that because we're not seeing the other alternatives on the side when it's being done automatically.
We have a lot to learn, right?
Lucas, what do you think? What's your view?
I think we have to equip ourselves and our learners by exploring how language is the biggest instrument that we have to exist. And it is through language that an artificial intelligence has been created, and by the use of language as well. So when we help learners and ourselves really to develop language awareness, we're developing, existence awareness, or the possibility of existence awareness. One in which we're not dominated by the instruments. We're not regulated, to borrow Vygotsky's terms here, we're not regulated by the instrument, whatever it is, but instead we can regulate it. I know that the big tech companies are, talking about slowing down the development of these intelligences, but I don't know if that's possible to slow it down. And even if we slow it down, we cannot prevent whatever effects we will have to face. That's my opinion. I think, Danielle, I think that's it from the audience. If you wanna.
Yeah, we do have some questions that are similar, okay, Kathleen and Joe, but I don't know if you have access to the chat. Maybe this last one from Arabella.
Okay.
What about teaching? Yeah, there were some questions, Kathleen and Joe, about some questions about teaching. I mean, how there was one, how do you see decolonial practices or decoloniality when compared to Brazilian and Australian contexts? There was one about the teaching, maybe examples. I don't know how this should be translated in the classroom. So they're all related to teaching, this decoloniality and teaching relationship. What about teaching? Let's see this one. What about teaching of English as a decolonizing language as a way to writing back? And is this variety all? Is this all the languages would be officially welcome to add their particularities? Yeah. So maybe some final comments on this. Maybe the relationship of decoloniality, well, in Australia and in Brazil, if you wish to comment, but mostly when it's translated into pedagogical practices.
Mm-hmm. Could I pick up on a question that Samara posed about how can we fight linguistic imperialism in the classroom? And I'll just give a little example that I think Australia is a very Anglo-dominant society, and students come to universities expecting that they're going to be studying through the medium of English. But what I do is I challenge my students to seek information in a language that is not English. So this puts the English-speaking students who feel that they are actually sort of in a very safe, secure position, and unsettles them because they've got to find information in languages that they do not know. And there's a very low level of learning of languages, additional languages in Australia. But whereas my international students or my multilingual, bilingual, multilingual students already know how to access information in languages that are not English. And they are the ones who then become the tutors for the monolingual dominant students. And so the monolingual students have to seek assistance from the bilingual and multilingual students in order to access information from other knowledge systems and through different languages. And at the moment, they are actually using human language technology. So we're using translation platforms to access information. And then the monolingual Anglo students have to collaborate with the bilingual students who are, the relationship changes. So what you've got is an equalizing of the relationship. So all of a sudden the Anglo students seem very insecure. And so that is a way of attempting to decolonize. But unfortunately, the human language technology platforms have not yet developed sufficient platforms for different languages. They tend to be obviously, the better known languages. Nevertheless, there are ways around that. So I just wanted to suggest that there are ways around that. And I think Joel can answer the other questions.
Well, I think there were some good suggestions in the chat, and I do like that idea of English as a decolonizing language. That would be a good one to develop, I think. I mean, I think welcoming, showing that students' own multilingualism is welcome in the classroom, but not just multilingualism, the way that they speak, the knowledge that they have, the way that their family lives and communicates, that is welcome in the classroom, that's recognized in the classroom, that's valued, and that's valued by other students. That's important. So whether you're defined as monolingual or multilingual, everybody deserves to have their own ways of speaking and knowing valued in the school. And that's the decolonial position, I think. So thinking about how we can do that as teachers, making it visible in the classroom, having examples of texts, multimodal text or audio or video that represent different ways of speaking, different identities. If we go beyond named languages in Brazil, we can think about, as I mentioned, Portuguese, but even registers like Papo Reto as a register that's different. And I think in terms of the different histories of colonization, we get some differences that might be interesting for an English language teacher to pick up on. For example, blackness has different meanings in Australia, where blackness is connected to Indigenous identities, but also to other Afro-diasporic identities. So, and in Brazil, of course, blackness is something which, if we think about in Portuguese, the different words that are used and how those terms have changed over time in terms of self-use or use as an insult. I think that's quite interesting. And looking at the technologies that have come around them and the movements that have come around them. So there is already quite a lot of stuff around Black Lives Matter as a movement, but if you looked at that in Australia and Brazil, it's quite different, because the main group who's been mobilising that term is Aboriginal Australians who identify as Black. So that's I mean, Indigenous Brazilians don't identify as Black. So that's definitely a distinction that could be interesting to talk about in a school setting and could bring up some good discussions.
Yeah, unfortunately time is over, but if I can contribute just with a little, I mean, here at the university, in my university, at the University of Sao Paulo, we are okay. We are all professors, lecturers from the English department, right, Joe, as you know, and we are under only English only policy. Let me tell you about that. So we're supposed to, and this is tradition. Who told you to do this, Danny? Well, the name is tradition, But and I'm teaching pronunciation. The practice of pronunciation of the English language. So I'm supposed to teach the phonetics and phonology, the sounds, blah blah blah. What I do, I mean the opposite. I mean I do that, but I also work with English as a lingua franca, multilingualism, plurilingualism, like showing them this variety of world Englishes, and mostly, Joe, just like you said, recognizing, and Lucas as well, recognizing their identities of English speakers, showing them that the variety that they speak is highly influenced by the Latin language, by Brazilian Portuguese, and it's okay. So this is something that I think it's very, decolonizing practices, and really negotiating all of these knowledges with students. And the work that we do in the undergrad, let's say, even though there's this only English only policy and etc., it's so rewarding. There's this reciprocity, let's say, at least in my view. Like yesterday, the students who would never say anything because they said, look, don't make me do this, my English is horrible. They were the ones speaking. And I was so happy. I said, do you remember you told me never to call you, and you raised your hand, because now they're very proud of the English that they can communicate with, with not under the ghost of the native, the two hegemonic Englishes that we do have in Brazil. So just a contribution how I see these decolonizing practices. Sometimes they're simple things, like you said, right? Like you guys mentioned, like showing them and recognizing and really negotiating all of this trans-knowledging, right? So yeah. But we do have a lot to do. We have a lot of work to be done. And I'd like to thank you a lot. I don't know if you have some final words for our Brazilian future teachers or researchers, and then we can finish the live. Do you, Kathleen and Joe, some final words?
Yeah, of course, Danielle. Just to say that I think that some of the most interesting and historically and currently subversive, groundbreaking work happens in Brazil, and that dialogue with Brazil is always a pleasure and a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to just also underscore that, but also to say that for me, I love hearing different accents and different varieties of English. I don't speak a UK or a US version of English. Mine is a South African English. And often I bring expressions from various languages that I know from South Africa into my English. And this sometimes unsettles students, but they find it quite amusing. But I found that a way of also of relating to my multilingual students who have come from very different backgrounds. Variety is wonderful. It's beautiful.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you very much, Michelle, Joe, Kathleen. It has been a pleasure. And let me tell you that many colleagues and they will be watching this later on. So thank you very much. And we hope we can keep on with our discussions and conversations, and because I think it's important. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
Danielle. Thanks,
everybody.
Lucas.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye. Bye.